I think we're going to get started here. We'll have a little bit of an introduction and people can, I'm sure, will keep joining us, hopefully. We are being hosted today by NCRAN, which is a relatively new collaboration, which you may or may not have heard of. Hopefully you have heard of us. We are a collaborative of extension professionals from the North Central region, and we're all passionate about aging and gerontology and really focusing on later life family issues. And our goal is really to help build resources in extension faculty across the region. We welcome other states and are curious, again, where you're coming from or joining us from today. We're also welcome non-extension professionals. So if you're in either of those categories, we do welcome you. So we are here today for a webinar on elder family financial exploitation. My name is Marlene Stum. I'm an extension faculty and professor at the University of Minnesota. My research and teaching has focused on later life families, particularly normative decisions that people face and often don't want to talk about. And we're clearly talking about one of those issues today. You will hear another voice join in once in a while, and that is Lacey Brown, who is a gerontology field faculty from South Dakota State University, part of our collaborative, and someone who's agreeing to help manage the chat today. So thanks, Lacey, for doing that. What are we going to cover? Well, as always, I'm sure I've planned too much, but my hope today is to really talk about the complexity and realities of elder family financial exploitation, which is a mouthful, which is why I will start saying EFFE. So when you hear that, that's what I'm talking about. We're going to talk about the costs and consequences on family systems. And in doing that, I really want to focus on dispelling some of the common misconceptions that are out there about EFFE. I think there's a fair number of them, and I'm hoping that through today's 1-hour webinar that you get some of those basics. I'll be talking about some of the research findings from a study we've been doing here in Minnesota on EFFE. I'll also be integrating in some existing literature so you can get a sense of the research base. And I'm hoping that we have some time and focus to talk about prevention education, particularly those of us in extension, and if you're other professionals, you may be trying to figure out what your role is in EFFE, what kind of opportunities are there, what kind of resources are there. So we will end the session with that. So that's where we're going. If that isn't what you thought you were getting yourself into, we invite you to join us anyway. So with that, some basics, webinar basics. Please mute yourself. I encourage you to find and use the chat box. One of the things I'm going to try today is asking a variety of questions. So you'll see this symbol for a quiz, and it's not to collect your answers. You can answer on your own piece of paper. You can put your answer in the chat. The purpose is really to keep you engaged and focused as we go along. So I'm going to try that as a strategy. And you're always welcome to put questions, concerns in the chat, and Lisa will be monitoring that. I also encourage you, if you're interested in getting these slides, to simply email me with that in the subject line. I'll send those to you. And as always, feel free to contact me if you're interested in any collaboration or questions. I see this as a beginning of a conversation. And know that this webinar is archived, so if you have others that you think could benefit from listening or you want to go back and review, it is available, will be available. So let's dig in. I want to start by defining the term. What is elder family financial exploitation? Here's a good working definition. The illegal, unauthorized, or improper use of an elder's resources, including funds, property, or assets. So it does include more than money. It includes things that could be of financial value. And it clearly is when a family member is a perpetrator. So that's the definition we're going off of. And we'll talk about, we'll dig in more into specifics as we go along. So given that, here's your first question. Again, put your answers in the chat box, respond on your own, keep your own tally, doesn't matter. Which of the following is the most prevalent type of elder abuse? What do you think? If you said E, you are correct. There are 7 recognized types of elder abuse broadly. And you will find today that I'm going to use the terms abuse and exploitation interchangeably. I'm not going to get picky about those definitions or terms, so know that. The point being that of all the types of elder abuse, we know that financial abuse is the most prevalent. And oftentimes I think we're not kind of accustomed to thinking about money issues historically as part of kind of domestic abuse. But it is. The close second would be self-neglect. Also know that if financial exploitation is the most common, there's several different types of financial exploitation. So drilling down a little bit more. Again, family is the most prevalent context for financial exploitation, not strangers or stranger scams or frauds. I know that there's lots of education out there. There's lots of energy around frauds and scams against elders. That's all very good work. But to put things in perspective, most people are more at risk of being having family exploitation than stranger exploitation. Sorry. So I say that to again try to keep things in perspective as you think about where the work is and what's getting attention in your community, in your state. Keep the relative importance of these in mind. Going any further, another common, I think, misconception is that most exploitation occurs in housing or care facilities for elders. Again, not the case. Much more commonly occurs in private homes, in people's, again, own private homes. That's where most elders live. That's where most of the exploitation occurs. So I know, for example, in Minnesota, we're having a lot of policy attention on concerns about elder abuse more broadly in care facilities. Again, there's some really bad things going on. But in the big picture, again, there's also many other issues that need attention. So what is financial exploitation? Where does it occur? Are important things to really get a handle on. All of that said, there is so much that we don't know. What we do know is that elder financial exploitation is highly underreported, and that isn't going to surprise anybody, I don't think, just as most elder abuse in general, domestic abuse in general is underreported. There's some some, I'm going to call them guesses. There's some estimates that are out there of how many are at risk. And you can see those figures in front of you. We know that victims rarely report, and obviously perpetrators aren't reporting. So that leaves other family members, it leaves third parties to report. And that is changing, I think, over time as more and more people understand financial exploitation and abuse. But lots of unknowns under that glacier. Your next question. So what do we really know then about EFFE? What do you think? If you said F, you're correct. Actually, it is very much true that the research around elder abuse in general and EFFE specifically is really in its infancy. We don't have good sound theory. We don't have conceptual frameworks that are consistently used. A lot of the methods are just at beginning stages. We don't always agree on how things are defined or how they're measured. And for the most part, there's very, very few data sources that really provide insight. Oftentimes when they are collected, they're collected from what I would call outsider perspectives, or they're not the perspective necessarily of the victim or the perpetrator or those involved. They may be adult protective service case files that are confidential, for example. So there's a lot of gaps in what we know because of all of that. There's not necessarily good data. So the bottom line is we're learning. There's efforts to increase the research, but at this point, there's a lot more questions than answers. And in particular, there's a real gap in what we know about how family members are affected by EFFE. And it's those voices and perspectives that can really provide some insight into what happens in families when EFFE occurs. What kind of toll does it take on family systems? What can, as you think about kind of secondary victims in domestic abuse, this is kind of like, what is it like for family members to have experienced this? In reality, there's about 4 existing studies in the US and internationally that have really attempted to listen to family members. So very, very few. Given that, several years ago, I really started focusing on this topic, and in collaboration with our nonprofit that's local, is a Minnesota Elder Justice Center. It has a statewide reach. We really realized what kind of gaps there are in the research and really wanted to start understanding a lot more about the stories, the experiences of family members. We also realized that in most cases, it's not going to be possible for numerous reasons to talk to the victim if they're still alive. And we didn't expect that perpetrators would talk with us, although there's another story there. And so we focused on trying to listen to and learn from a family member who was not the victim and not the perpetrator, but somebody else who's experienced this. So we started this study again several years ago. We have collected data. We're in the analysis and writing phase. We did semi-structured interviews. We gathered some brief written survey data, and you can get a sense of a variety of the types of information that we've gathered. Today, I'm going to focus mostly on kind of who's involved in terms of victims and perpetrators and the consequences for family systems. There's a lot more to come, and we're, again, kind of in the middle of that. We basically talked with family members who said they had experienced elder family financial exploitation in their family. These are not all court cases. These are not necessarily verified or that they meet state criteria or statutes defined by financial exploitation. But in general, we know that in talking with people, when we recruited people, almost, well, all of them would qualify as financial exploitation according to the statutes. So who did we listen to and learn from? Again, for the most part, we talked with the adult child of the victim and or the sibling of the perpetrator. There were some grandchildren involved, some in-laws involved, and we fully realized that we are getting the perspective of one family member, again, non-perpetrator, non-victim. Not everybody in the family, but it's one window into the world of what was this experience like, and you can see the characteristics of our sample. For the most part, I think all of these individuals would say that they serve as the advocate for the elder in their family, for their parent. And I call them, for good or bad, I shouldn't have said that, but I call them the good family member, because for the most part, they really always had the best interests of the elder in mind for what they were doing. They were trying to intervene, they're trying to get help, as opposed to the perpetrator motives. So think of them as individuals who are highly motivated to help that elder. That's the role they were playing. And go back to thinking about how many cases are reported and unreported. We probably have a few more people in here that have reported these cases, again, because they're trying to get help. They're active family members. And they may not have reported always to kind of the formal adult protective services, but they have in some way, 14 of them have involved some type of system. For example, they might have gone to a credit card company. They might have gone to the banker. Others that could help sort out what was going on. We also have several people in here who who actually have convictions in that family. So they've gone to court and they have a conviction of that perpetrator, which is honestly in the big picture pretty rare today. So that's kind of who we listen to. Here's some examples of what they're experiencing. The one that sticks in my mind the most is this daughter's comment. It's been 2 years of hell, and I'll let you read it. Lots of ups and downs, lots of unknowns. This is somebody who's obviously in the process of dealing with EFFE, where others, in some cases, we talked with people whose parent had already passed on, and they were at a different stage of kind of grieving and dealing with their loss. Another family member says this: I can't ever remember mistrusting my siblings or my parents on anything until this happened. So you can see this is pretty jarring to have to go through. Very much an out of the blue kind of experience for this family member. And I guess the lesson in all of this is that, as others would say, not in a million years did I think this would happen in my family. So again, emphasizing that no one is exempt. So let's talk about, move on and kind of get a profile of who are the victims in elder financial exploitation. So again, what do you think? You're all very good. You're getting the right answer. It's fun for me to see your answers in the chat box. Thank you for doing that. All of the above is correct. There, again, is a lot that's not known, but of what we know about victims, again, the female, widowed, isolated, needing some help with daily living is, all of those are some of the key risk factors that we know about. In the sample that, in our study, we have a sense of who are the victims. And again, I think part of the message I want you to take away is, again, keep in mind, our study is in no way meant to be, designed to be or meant to be representative or tell us a lot about prevalence, but give us some insight of kind of the range and scope of what's being experienced. And I think the message is there's, again, a lot of variety, a wide range of victims. To not get too caught up in kind of some of the stereotypes of this is the person who's most at risk. That could be, but there's a lot of variety. Not all are females, not all are widowed. Some are really quite young. If I can say at 60 is not your probably image of someone at risk of elder financial exploitation. And what is true, I think over and over again, is most have some kind of either mental or physical or healthcare issues that they're dealing with. That said, not all have dementia. So again, keep a wide eye as to who are really the victims, who's at risk. Again, it could be anyone. One of the things we learned early on is I think it's easy in terms of if I think I needed more coffee this morning. In terms of EFFE is to think that there's going to be one victim and one perpetrator. And that can be the case, but in several cases in ours, and again, it highlights the fact that in some cases, both parents were victims. And oftentimes that exploitation escalated when one of the partners died. So again, don't assume that there's just one victim. The other thing to know is that there's been other work on this, and again, in this study, we really saw this, that in many cases, there's more than one kind of abuse going on. That financial abuse is perhaps the tip of the iceberg that people are willing to talk about, but there's other things going on. And the academic word for that would be polyvictimization, that there's multiple types of abuse going on. And probably the most common connected one to financial abuse would be neglect, or followed that by emotional verbal abuse that we see happening. And we clearly saw that in our cases with other kinds of a long history of abuse. We have through our Minnesota Elder Justice Center, we have a victim assistance person who is there to listen to victims who call her. Excuse me. And she often hears, she gets, her most frequent calls are actually from family members, those secondary victims, just like we talked with. And the vast majority will call her about EFFE. And then as she talks with them, they go on to disclose, oh, but there's this going on, there's also that going on. So again, that multiple types of abuse, to know that that's also a potential. Again, very few studies because there's little national data, but this is one of the one that you'll see cited a fair amount. You'll notice it's 2010. And it's the only study I'm aware of that's really looked at, had enough of a national representative sample to look at some differences in EFFE. And again, all of this highlights that there are some key risk factors that work together. Again, we saw these. And I think what's important to note is that the demographics dropped out. So it's not just gender, it's just not marital status alone working, but it's other factors working. Another question for you. Does planning in advance for changes in decision-making protect you from EFFE? If you have a power of attorney, if you have a will, should that protect you from EFFE? True or false? You're all getting high scores today. False is the answer. Again, I was surprised when we asked people what kinds of decision-making tools were in place for that elder, for that parent, at the time of the exploitation. So we asked about 6 different kinds of documents that you could put together. You'll see 5 of them listed there. And most of them had a fair number. Again, I was surprised at that. Again, we had 23 elder victims. So this is 17 of 23, 15 of 23 that you're looking at. So clearly not all. And we'll talk about the kinds of exploitation, but I think it's a common assumption that if you just plan in advance that you're not going to be at risk. So again, another myth to kind of bust, I think. And we'll get into some of the reasons why planning, that's not to say we want to discourage planning, but there's better ways to plan and some other protections that need to be in place. So that's a little glimpse of victims. Let's move on to who are the perpetrators. Again, keep in mind a wide range of perpetrators. In our study, you can see the ages, marital status, both males and females, whether they were working or not. Again, could be anybody. The stereotype I know that's out there is the typical perpetrator is a son who is living in the basement with their parent. It's always in the basement. And they are financially dependent for some kind of reason, whether they're divorced, they lost some income, they're under or unemployed. And oftentimes you can add substance abuse or addictions to that list. Again, a stereotype, does that happen? Absolutely. But clearly, just because you're an adult child living with a parent doesn't, in and of itself, make you a perpetrator. So beware of some of the, again, the stereotypes that are out there. There's great variation of perpetrators. The other thing that I was not expecting is how many perpetrators there often were in a family. Again, in most cases, more than one. And you'll see the combinations that we had in our study. So it might be an adult child, their spouse, and their child. It might be the adult child and their spouse only. It might be the adult child working with other siblings. So cross-generation, multiple family members. So that was surprising. That again, to think it's a lot more than sometimes one person that's working together. The next question. Caregiver stress is a key factor in family members becoming perpetrators. True or false? Got a variety of answers. Good. The answer would be false, and here's why. Again, in my mind, this is one of those myths that's out there that, or assumptions that's out there, and I see it repeated over and over again, and that it's the caregivers who are so stressed, and that's why they're doing the financial exploitation. Here's the evidence, I should say, as to why that's not necessarily the case. Yes, there are caregivers who are stressed that are financial exploiters, but you can read the list. Not everyone that's stressed is an abuser. Abusers typically target only the older adult, not others. So there's a variety of reasons that I think people talk about caregiver stress to create sympathy for themselves, but it's not in and of itself, again, a key factor that is found. So beware of that one. There are some other kind of profiles or signs that go with perpetrators. You'll find that many give conflicting explanations of, in this case, kind of what money was used for what purpose. They continually change that story. They're very good at deliberately isolating the victim. Isolation is a key issue in EFFE, as well as other kinds of elder abuse. You'll see perpetrators are pretty darn good at controlling and dominating, and they often portray themselves as the victim, as I'm the only one in this family that really cares about mom or dad. I'm the only one acting in their best interests. It's everyone else that's trying to do them in. And they can be very charming and helpful and believable. I think of a media piece that was done locally of a gentleman that was convicted of financial exploitation, and his comment was, I mean, this is a son who had kept his mother in really filthy, extreme neglect situation, and had drained her resources for his own use. And he said, I love my mom. I would never do this to her. You know, I don't know what you're talking about. So who are the perpetrators? Some signals of what's going on. And one area that I'm particularly interested in learning more about is that almost all perpetrators feel entitled to an elder's resources. And for a variety of reasons, because I'm the caregiver, because I know I'm going to get the inheritance anyway, I'm just taking it now. I'm just closing the gap because my siblings all have money and I deserve to have as much as they do. I'm making up for past issues in my family, and the list goes on and on. So one of the pieces we have looked at in the study is entitlement, and we haven't, I'm not going to focus on that much here at all, except to say that it's an issue and that there'll be more to come on that, because I think it's a key issue in education. So some sense around perpetrators. Next question. Is misuse of the power of attorney the most common type of EFFE, meaning the strategy that people use? Are most of them power of attorney? What do you think? Yes or no? As I was thinking how I would mark that question, I realized that I think anecdotally, everyone I know in the field would say it's false. Do we have solid data to show that? No. So if you want to argue with me on this one, you're welcome to. We really I'm moving really on to what are the strategies that perpetrators use? What is it they're doing to exploit people? And I think, again, a common assumption is that most of them are abusing the power of attorney, the financial power of attorney. And I'm assuming you may or may not necessarily know what that is. And so I wanted to offer up a definition for those of you who this isn't necessarily your current expertise. And this is similar but different to a healthcare power of attorney, as you know, where you name a fiduciary, which is another word that you have to come to know and understand if you're dealing with exploitation. A fiduciary is someone who, again, you select to manage your money and who obviously you need to trust that they will do the following things, that they're going to act in your best interest as the person to be helped, that they're able to manage that money carefully, that they can keep their own money separate, and they can keep good records. That's kind of the major expectations of a fiduciary. And there are multiple kinds of fiduciaries. Again, the one for the most part, we're going to focus on is power of attorney. So there are some things, as you can guess, that can go horribly wrong with a power of attorney, and people take advantage of that because they don't understand, because they misinterpret, or in some cases they're very intentional. For example, gifting money to themselves because they think that's appropriate. So what are some of the strategies people use? They do use misusing power of attorney, but that's one of many. Again, in our study, we found that there were multiple and changing methods that people used, typically not just one. And this is a start of that list. What is it they're doing? Family members would tell us, you know, we thought we had it figured out. We would discover one thing they were doing and they would switch to another. So again, I can distinctly recall people talking about a roller coaster ride that they were on. Constant changing methods of how they were taking advantage of that elder and using their resources.
Webinar I'm trying to listen.
One of the things to keep in mind, and I'm going to start speeding up here, is the intergenerational context. So I've talked a little about victims and perpetrators, but obviously all of that, I'm just going to do a reminder to mute your mic for everyone who's not. And the context for perpetrators and victims obviously occurs in a larger family system. So one of the things we've looked at a lot is what's going on in that family system that helps perhaps protect against EFFE and or helps enable EFFE. And I'm just going to leave it at that, I think, for now. So I want to give you a quick glimpse into the connections to health and well-being. And I'm going to run through this faster than I wanted, and I'm going to cut some of this short. But I will also say that in 1 hour, I can only do so much and without overwhelming you. And so I am very willing to do more depth on EFFE and take on certain issues. So I see this as the first. So if and how is EFFE connected to health? So on the front end, we know that health issues put the older adult at risk of being victims and family members of being perpetrators. So whether it's a broad definition of health from physical, cognitive, mental, social, financial, are all possible risk factors. What we wanted to look at again and understand is what are the consequences of EFFE for health? And I didn't necessarily set out asking that question, but wanting to understand the consequences. And what became clear in analyzing the data is that all dimensions of health are potentially impacted. And again, I'm using a broad definition of the kind of health that we talk about, including economic well-being. And all of those obviously intersect. It's hard to tease apart what's the intersecting pieces that we have. But in many cases, this is exactly what people were talking about, the impact on health and the losses that they experienced. We have 6 types of consequences that family members talked about. I'm not going to go through all of them. Again, I'd be glad to share more about this. We're in the process of writing on this. But I wanted to give you some sense of what are the consequences. And again, we know, you may have heard the phrase, families are never the same after EFFE. And again, we wanted to kind of dig into that and say how and why. And I think one of the things that was consistently found and said by all family members is that of all these 6 consequences, the one that was the most powerful and the most dramatic for them was redefining who's family and the loss of family. It wasn't about the money. So it was as much about the loss of critical social, emotional relationships as it was about anything that was financial. And I think that's a key takeaway as we think about what are the consequences, helping people understand that it's not just about the money. There are clearly financial losses that are going on, but there's all kinds of consequences that impact health. And again, I'm going to choose to kind of switch around here. I want to highlight a couple of things that, again, the changes in relationships and functioning over time, that we saw a lot of losses in closeness, in trust, in loyalty, and a lot more distance, hostility, and disengagement, which probably doesn't surprise anybody. But we also had families who were never close. So again, people are starting at different points in time, and they have different characteristics the way they would talk about their family. In almost all cases, there were processes of what we'll talk about as cutting off and taking sides. So there were clearly splits within the family of the impact of this. And I think I will have you at least read this quote. Lots of broken relationships, whether it's the cutting off the perpetrator, cutting off or being isolated from a parent. Lots of very emotionally painful situations. With that, I'm going to skip ahead. And actually, I want to say one thing. I've emphasized the consequences and the layers of loss. There was at least a couple of people who talked about some positives, that something good came out of all of this, and that was that they were now closer to some family members than they had ever been. They had strengthened those relationships. For some, this was a sibling perhaps that they had never been close with, but now they are, or again, had strengthened a relationship. So there can be some positive outcomes, but they're in the context of major, major losses. So I'm going to stop there. The goal of our project is really to move on, to keep analyzing, and also to start translating and disseminating what we're learning into prevention and intervention strategies. So what does all this mean for education? What should we be helping people understand? How do we reach certain audiences? Who needs to know what? And I'm, again, guessing that many of you are interested in or have a role in education, whether it's extension or not. So I'm curious, what have you already known, or what did you hear or learn about in this quick presentation that has implications for prevention education? What does it say about content or target audiences? If you would share some ideas.
So we have a couple comments in the chat box. Marlene, do you see them?
I do. I thought I would just give people time to think a little bit, and then we'll talk about some of these, but I'm trying to track them. Think about what is it that family members, adult children, elders, what do they need to know to help kind of prevent, if it's possible, prevent EFFE or deal with the reality of EFFE? Good ideas, good thoughts, if you're tracking or you're thinking. Let me go to this next one, continue on. What do you see in your own community that is needed around EFFE? And these answers may be the same as what you just wrote. I just want to comment on the person who said, I've experienced EFFE and I'm stumped by prevention. And I think that's, again, a similar comment from some family members is, I don't know. I really don't know what would have prevented it in my family. And others, they had some clues. They should have known some things. So again, great variation. One of the things we ask family members is, what lessons have you learned? What would you tell others? And again, we have some of that information to share. Let me try to make some sense of your comments, and I encourage you, if you want to unmute yourself. We're a relatively small group, so I don't think I'll be creating a disaster by doing that, but think about, again, I hope you're kind of looking at the chat box as well, and we'll look at some ideas. I want to share some of these relate to your comments. So these are my ideas of prevention education, and I think clearly there are some things that we can do to improve what family members know, some of the skills they have, and some of what they would do. And as I talk with, again, people from individuals and victim services at our Justice Center, a lot of what she does and encourages is really normalizing those conversations. And I think I see bits of that in things that you've written. Make it normal to talk about this issue. Realize how prevalent it is. Understand the dynamics. Understand it's not just a family matter. We continue to fight that battle of even recognizing that exploitation can be a civil and criminal matter, that it's not just a private family matter to be handled internally necessarily, and that no one is exempt. So again, what can we do as educators to really normalize those conversations? And I think there's a variety of tools that we can create. I also think it's really important to separate this from the stranger financial exploitation, scams, and fraud information that's out there. There's a lot of really good materials out there by Commerce, by AARP, by others. And again, all of that's very important, but we also need to focus on EFFE. Any comments on any of that? So I think one of the goals is normalizing conversations, having tools to help family members talk. The other thing I want to say is that I don't believe this is just a matter of individuals doing more or knowing more, because there are larger structural issues. There are things that you can't change that's going to influence EFFE. So in a way, blaming the individual or family members is not the answer. Many of you mentioned more information around POAs, how power of attorneys can be part of the problem. They can also be part of the solution. And I think everyone who works with this issue really recognizes that there's a lot of misunderstandings about power of attorney, the fiduciary roles that we talked about, particularly who do you select as your attorney in fact. And again, we see people selecting people who have a long history of addiction, abuse, because they live next door, really not thinking too clearly about who they're selecting. So yes, I think there's a whole range of work to be done around that. In addition, I don't get good reception from anybody in policy around this, but I think, you know, what if we actually trained power of attorneys? This doesn't mean they have to go through a week's worth of classes, but we know that very few people are prepared for that role and responsibility. I'm guessing many of you may be in that role or have done it, and it's like, how do you know what you're supposed to do and not do? So I think just as we have Parents Forever training for those who are divorcing, I think it would be a perfect role to do some mandatory training that doesn't have to be, that could cover some basics. So that's my dream. In all of that, I hope you know that there are some existing resources for fiduciaries that are out there. They're really good. They, again, help people understand a lot more about power of attorney. And here's some things to come. I will be adding a blog post to the website, the NCRAN website, and things that I will be developing. you'll see a list of that. They will be in process this year, and they are coming. Just so you know that somebody's working on these. They will hopefully be listed on the programs and resources that we have on the NCRAN site. If you have any interest, thoughts, I'd be glad to talk to you about any of those resources. And because I'm talking, I can't necessarily read all the chat. So I promise to go back and read those. And if you want to follow up and ask me a question or share an idea, please do that. One last thing, because I know we're out of time. I wanted to I couldn't see leaving this call without at least saying, I hope you are aware of your own responsibility as an employee and whether or not you're a mandated reporter. And here are some resources. So I'm going to go through these too fast. So I'll share my email in a minute.
I got it.
Request the slides. Thank you. M. Stum, you got it. Lisi, thank you. And I hope that you take some time and learn about your own state definitions and statutes, and particularly, are you a mandated reporter? And what does that mean? And there's, again, between the Department of Justice and the National Center for Elder Abuse, those are two key sites that you can go to and find that information. With that said, I know we are out of time. I am perfectly willing to stay on here. We don't have to get off for the Zoom purpose. Lisi has put in the chat box the link. We would love for you to evaluate this webinar and let us know. And if you are interested in other content or want more depth or details on EFFE, I would be delighted if you would let me know. Again, my email is mstum@umn.edu. And with that, I am going to open it up to any questions. And thank you for hanging in there with a quick 1 hour. I hope you've learned something. I hope some of the assumptions you may have thought about with EFFE were covered and addressed. And there's lots and lots of work to do on this issue. So it's a fascinating, complex issue and very important. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. Thank you all for joining in. Many of us in the Midwest have survived this week of cold polar vortex and trying to get back to normal here. So thank you all for joining in. Contact me if you would like.
And please do our survey. Chelsea put a link and I put a link in the box, or the same. But please complete our survey for us.
Thank you all.